It's been an interesting year for everyone who manages an international supply chain. I think by now most of us thought we'd have some clarity about the situation, particularly as we're about to wrap up this year and head into the next. Yet most people I speak with feel just as uncertain now as they did 6 months ago. We seem to have no more clarity about Brexit than we did at the beginning of the year, and hopes that we'd be well past COVID by now are clearly not going to happen for most nations. So it's time to look at how other companies are navigating this challenging situation. One company that was able to get out ahead of the curve is Sainsbury's. A big part of their ability to survive has been the strengths of their global supply chain. To learn more about exactly what they're doing and how they're preparing for 2021, I sat down with Dean Clegg, Global Sourcing Director. Dean successfully led the company's global supply team through the operational challenges of coronavirus this spring, managing to keep both his business and its suppliers healthy. However, a big part of what's keeping Sainsbury's in solid shape is the supply chain strategy that Dean implemented well before COVID even came onto the radar. It's a strategy that has a long-term vision, but is also very agile. By working his plan and adapting as needed, Sainsbury's was able to quickly make the necessary adjustments in sourcing and get its business back on track fairly quickly. Beyond steering the company's supply chain through COVID, Dean led the successful integration of Argos stores in Sainsbury's. He's been instrumental in shaping a new estate strategy for the company and has driven the company towards higher quality and greater sustainability. Today, he's mapping out a plan to take Sainsbury's through 2021, with Brexit coming into effect in January and no idea whether it's going to be a hard exit or not. At the same time, the pandemic continues to rage on. Before we get started, if you're looking for a sharp view of global sourcing, or you're struggling to get your quarterly sourcing reports done, you might want to take a look at the current situation in sourcing. These executive snapshot reports include all the insights and data you need without you having to do the work. If you'd like more information, there's a link in the show notes here. Dean, thank you for joining us today. So I'm really interested in hearing your views on where you see shifts happening in the supply chain, and particularly how you're working around changes that could be coming with Brexit.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the invite, Jane. It's good to be with you, and you're certainly right. It's been an interesting year so far in terms of 2020, and I think the future is going to be equally as interesting as well, and a number of dynamics at play. And to your point, Brexit is definitely one of those. I think on Brexit, if maybe I just spend a few minutes and just share a few thoughts around that. I think the overarching piece for us as an organisation, and certainly for the sourcing side, is one of sensible planning, but no knee-jerk actions will be the kind of overall summary piece, or certainly the principle we try to adopt. And obviously, we all know around the timeline, from the end of December, there'll be two realities around Brexit. One, more simpler in terms of a more simple outcome in terms of the UK as an organised new relationship with Europe, or indeed the no deal scenario, which is well publicised in the press, which obviously means no trade agreements. And I should probably just first of all say that obviously the UK is, we are, Sainsbury's Argos. The Sainsbury's brand is food first, actually. So 80% of our products are food. And obviously
Right.
Europe is, kind of one of our biggest source of that food. And over the last 2 years, there's been a significant amount of planning been done on the food side and all the complexity that might bring. And then moving on to you kind of more closer to home in terms of sourcing and what might happen. My personal sense, I probably should say, is that I think there probably will be a deal, but who knows? But certainly the kind of the feel is that it's heading in that direction. So maybe fingers crossed around that. If a deal is struck, around Brexit, then we are into a continuity position. Under UK GSP, so the General Scheme of Preferences, the UK basically continues to provide trade preferences to the same countries as the EU's General Scheme of Preferences. So
Right.
kind of that level of continuity stays. So Bangladesh, for instance, for us in terms of EBA, zero duty that will remain. India, which sits in the standard framework for a developing country, would stay under GSP terms at 9.5%. All that would stay.
Right.
The no deal one is obviously the more interesting one. As I said before, again, I think we don't overreact, but by definition, what this means is that by default, a no deal Brexit means that we trade under WTA rules, and therefore most favoured nation treatment kicks in to ensure a level of consistency across the piece. And what that means for us is that there's advantages and disadvantages. So there's kind of some pluses and minuses in terms of what that means around tariffs. And that's obviously going to be one that we, need to stay very close to and need to understand. And some examples there would be the move to most favourable nations would mean, zero duty for China. So, China will be in a much better place. However, on the clothing side, Turkey is key manufacturers and key sources in terms of apparel. And without a trade agreement, there would be an impact to Sainsbury's of several million. So, you've got the balance there between the China and the Turkey piece. And then obviously there are lots of other considerations, not just around the tariffs, but certainly where we've got European supply in terms of, whether it be furniture from Eastern Europe or indeed that apparel from Turkey. And then understanding movements of goods across Europe is going to be important because, increased cost, impact on speed, etc., is going to be something that we would need to really understand. And then the final bit I'd say, Jane, would be that tariffs are important, without a doubt. They're a determining factor in terms of our kind of strategy and our approach to sourcing. But they're not the only factor. And I think it's really, really important that, retailers and, indeed ourselves, we take a very balanced view in terms of all the other factors that make kind of go into why we source from a certain country. And the other one I would say, actually, just on that Turkey piece, is that this bit around short-term view versus medium to long-term view, because actually what might end up without a trade agreement on a no-deal Brexit to start with might actually, and probably will, over a period of time, end up with a trade agreement. So therefore, going back to my original point around really sensible, considered decision making, really understanding in terms of staying close to detail, but not necessarily knee-jerk.
Right. So in other words, if the UK ends up leaving the EU without a deal, you would see going forward, most likely, the UK would then be negotiating its own bilateral trade agreements with individual trading partners over a period of time.
Absolutely, Jen, yeah.
And thus you'd be planning your sourcing with that in mind.
I think you have to. And then the point around staying close to the conversation, staying close to the detail. I think there'll be a lot of things that will be being publicised, being talked about, being shared, actually, because I think what nobody really wants is a level of confusion, distraction. I think everybody probably is aiming for a level of continuity. But going to my point earlier, I think what you do have is an element of confusion that is out there, and uncertainty. Sometimes breeds a level of reaction around that, and I think we need to make sure we're making those decisions with all the facts at play, and look to very much that kind of short term. We might a sourcing officer might make some decisions based on short term advantage, only to find that 12 months down the path that that decision maybe was slightly flawed.
Right. So you have to really balance your short term gain with your medium to long term gain and risk. So you can't really be too opportunistic, because you could end up shooting yourself in the foot further down the road.
I think so. And, and then it comes back to the point I referenced earlier that, chasing tariffs and focus on tariffs is only one decision factor in terms of for which country you might source from, and all those other factors in terms of level of expertise, strength of relationships, wider supply chains, etc. All those other factors, are key. And all of those in turn, as well as just the tariff piece, have a commercial impact.
Right. I think that, tariffs get an awful lot of visibility in the media. They tend to be more exciting, so to speak. What are some of the other things aside from tariffs that are at the top of the list right now for you?
Yeah. So if you take Brexit in terms of understanding in terms of where our existing supply country of origins are, I think will be really important. Understanding that points around raw material costs, levels of expertise, relationships that we've got, flexibility. I think there are a whole host of things that we would want to make sure that we were considering in terms of, I think it's a very big decision for anybody to kind of move out of a supply country based on just purely around tariffs, and that's before you've even touched on things like understanding around capability in terms of sustainability, ethical elements, etc.
Right, right. Well, I think that's just it. I think that tariffs can come and go, and the amount of time it takes to develop a supplier or a supply chain is far longer than that, and could be more disruptive, as you're saying. So it makes sense that you wouldn't be radically making shifts.
I agree, Jen. And I think that this year that we've been through so far, all of us experienced a lot, and all of us have learned a lot. So if you take, the year so far, I think it's been a highly changeable year. definitely had its challenges for us all, and obviously lots of dynamics at play. The way our customers are shopping in terms of the products that they're buying, and indeed how they're shopping in terms of digital versus physical. Another big dynamic around how we are working together. Whether that be how we're working with our colleagues in the UK, how we're working with our suppliers, and how we're working with our colleagues around Asia, and also the dynamics around pressure points that still exist there in terms of pressure points that our suppliers are facing, and pressure points that our retailers are also under. So highly changeable, challenging at times, and lots of dynamics at play. I think from a Sainsbury's perspective, we had, probably pause here for a second, we had a sourcing strategy that we'd been working up over, a global sourcing strategy that we've been working up over the last 12 months prior to COVID hitting down the beginning of this year. And that sourcing strategy focused very much around driving improved efficiencies, reducing cost of operation, and improving profitability and reducing the cost of goods. So all the notable obvious things. And the summary experience for us, and the enhancing experience, has been that COVID has actually accelerated our strategy. And just to touch on maybe a few examples around that. So if you take flexibility was a key part of our strategy, understanding what is the right country mix. Do we have all our eggs in one basket in certain areas? So the importance of width of supply, more important than ever through coronavirus. The importance of dual sourcing, and dual sourcing not just in terms of between countries, although that is important, but also within countries as well. So if there are challenges in terms of how do the suppliers maintain that continuity of supply. So flexibility, a big part of our strategy, and absolutely progressed through COVID. Speed would be another one. The desire for shorter lead times, again, even more important in a COVID challenged world in terms of supporting uncertainty, shorter timelines between key decision making moments. Transparency and trust, the need for collaboration. Our customers have been more demanding. They want to know where their products come from. We had that on the pad already in terms of we track and we have visibility around all our tier one supply base. But, now through coronavirus, there's a desire even more so to kind of progress that transparency down to tier two and tier three elements of the supply chain. Drive on efficiency in terms of how do we take cost out, as I said earlier, removing duplication, embracing digital. We're now into our, kind of second and third buying trips, again, and we're learning all the time in terms of doing those into a more effective digital way rather than the physical, the traditional approach in terms of, kind of visitors between countries, and also visiting factories. So embracing digital and everything that brings. And then a really big one for us around that strategy is around empowering our suppliers. So again, already had it on the pad. We were working towards that, Jane. But actually, through coronavirus, in terms of things like the progression of self-inspection, I've already mentioned buying trips, sample approvals, lab accreditations, fabric testing. Again, doing a combination of more in Asia, but also more at our suppliers, particularly our strategic suppliers. Again, really progressed through. And then I've already touched on sustainability. our customers are, again, more inquisitive. They want to know how our products are made. So we are now accelerating through in terms of reporting. So things like HIG within clothing and the textile elements of general merchandise. We've got some overarching targets around net zero by 2040 as an organisation, 50% reduction in our packaging. And again, all that on the back of COVID in terms of heightened awareness, but heightened desirability around sustainability, increasingly progressed forward. In fact, I read somewhere a report actually, I think the other day actually, he said that something like 50% of customers would actually use sustainability as a decision maker in terms of why they bought a certain product, and I think that is absolutely there now. And for us, the importance of working with our supply base around sustainability and ultimately getting to a place, I think, particularly if we're making some choices around who is going to supply certain products, etc., or who is actually indeed going to be a supplier, then we would use sustainability, I'm sure, in terms of a prioritising piece as to actually which supplier do we go with. So I think, hopefully that kind of brings alive a little bit, in terms of, but the summary bit would be we had a strategy. We'd spent about a year working up that global sourcing strategy, pinned around things like efficiency and costs. And all those areas, from efficiency, sustainability, speed, flexibility, have all been progressed through supplier empowerment on the back of the last 10 months in terms of whilst we've all been facing into the challenge around coronavirus.
Right. Well, I think that certainly, as you're saying, having had plans in advance has been a huge benefit, whereas some people did not and were caught out. In terms of speed and flexibility, what are you doing that's bringing that through? Because I know a lot of people talk about speed and flexibility, but there's many different ways to implement that.
Yeah, I mean, both really important, actually. And we take the flexibility piece. I think, again, relating it back to COVID, I think what it's really showed us and taught us probably all, actually, you need to have that level of that flexibility. You need to be able to have, we source from over, well, certainly just in the Asia area alone, actually, we source from, circa a dozen countries. So we're reasonably well spread. We've got, product groups, whether it be, women's wear that will have women's apparel that will take out to Bangladesh, will take out to China, will take out to Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. So we're reasonably well spread. But I think what coronavirus has definitely showed us is that, or taught us, is that actually we probably need more flexibility, and we need to be able to react to. So there is situations, and I think there still will be actually situations where, through the impact of COVID, that our supply channel is not as robust as we would like it to be. And our ability to turn on with whether it be another supplier in that country or indeed another country, in terms of things like making sure that we have that visibility around things like, as much of the process we've done as possible around things like, sample improvement. They've got the capability to be able to manufacture that product at short notice. So trying to take time out of the critical path to ensure that actually there is a required to dual source, that we can do that relatively quickly. But also around that, what we might want to do is hedge some bets actually and do some dual sources, not even just wait for a moment in time to hit. And then on speed, one of the things within and I would accept that I think we are still probably too complicated at times, and I think we probably still duplicate too much. And when I say duplicate, I mean duplicate between what we do here in global source in Asia versus what activities we do in the UK versus what our kind of factories and our suppliers can do. I think we maybe are a little bit too traditional in our approach. Now, the good thing through the strategy that we've put together, we're now starting to roll out. We're now starting to kind of crash through some of those sacred cows about where samples do need to be approved. The confidence that we have in our manufacturing base to self-inspect. So I think all those elements actually, build that level of confidence and enable us to, do things in a more efficient way, removing that duplication and ultimately taking time out of, reducing the time out of our critical path and able to get that product to our customers quicker. I think, logistics would also come into that as well. we did our first. We did one a few years ago, Jen. Actually, but first in recent years, actually, we did our first train logistics kind of supply from China that we'd not done for many years.
Oh, you mean using the Eurasia Rail?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, sea freight because obviously speed, you've always got to counter in terms of what does that mean around cost. But, sea freight would always be most advantage in terms of, from a cost perspective, but actually, rail versus air freight, again, it's another balance piece that gives another option.
We saw that throughout this pandemic, this Eurasia Rail, certainly for people sourcing in Asia and sending to Europe, this has been a lifesaver. So, from what you're saying then, you're seeing, in a broad-based way, a greater diversification of countries and of individual suppliers, whereas I think previously we had seen, certainly post-WTO, much more of a consolidation. And now we're really seeing, more of a fragmentation.
I agree, but also I'd counter it slightly by saying that I think consolidation is still very important. So another part of our strategy is very much around making sure that we've got the right quantity of suppliers and the role of, let's say, key suppliers versus strategic partners. So I think overall, I think what we're saying is I think that our number of suppliers will actually still consolidate and it will still come down as a total number. However, within that, I think we still have to have that level of flexibility, particularly around what I mentioned earlier, around in terms of different countries. And also, I think, within countries as well, in terms of ensuring that we've got a level of innovation and a level of newness. So I almost see that the total and cumulative number is probably coming down, actually, but there are increments actually where we might increase only then to decrease at a later date. So I think overarching, I think consolidation is still important.
In terms of flexibility and speed and pricing and all that, how do you see 3P working in, third-party service providers? Do you see that as being part of the picture?
Yeah, I think it's, we would, first of all, would say that actually two things really. One, we were set up here as a direct sourcing function. So having that direct relationship with our supply base and everything that goes with that in terms of the commercial value, but right the way through to things like increased level of transparency, ethical, etc. So I think we are very much set up for that. We now, and again, this is part of our strategy, global sourcing strategy, is we are now putting our arms around the whole of our own brand supply, which includes DI third party, so where we're using agents. And the reason why we're doing that is it gives us the full picture, and it gives you that complete visibility on it and that ability to make the right decision. Direct source for us will always be really important for all the reasons I've mentioned. But actually, we have to acknowledge that actually working with third parties also adds a lot of value. So let me just so if you and I think a lot of it depends on where you're up to as well in terms of your development life cycle. So if you take somewhere like let me give you an example. If you take somebody like some products like footwear, for instance. So we're a very credible retailer in the UK in terms of men's, women's, children's wear, apparel. We do sell footwear, but we're not massive into footwear, and therefore, using a third party for somewhere like footwear is probably a very sensible decision for us. And also, if you think about some of the areas that require a greater degree of technical understanding and focus. I mean, we work with let's call it faster fashion in terms of Near East, and we have a number of very important relationships in Turkey. And again, they give us a level of experience, particularly around our ability to get products quicker to customers. That whole piece around product development and turnaround. But at the same time, we have a very established, Far East direct source business around women's wear that actually still does elements of fast fashion, but actually, maybe a little bit more skewed to some more of the staple product areas. So to go back to your question, how do we see it? I think we see it very much around direct source is for us incredibly important, but there is definitely a role for third party as well.
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting because we're definitely seeing a lot of people who would never have considered 3P as part of the picture now starting to see it as having its advantages in terms of, like you said, flexibility, speed, expertise, and things like that. In terms of your supply chain, what's Sainsbury's superpower?
A nice word, Jane. Superpower. I think I tease out maybe three or four things. So the first one I would say is supply base. We've been a global sourcing operation with a strong base out here in Asia. So we've got offices, our main hub office in Hong Kong, but we've got offices in Shanghai. We've got offices in India and Bangladesh. We've got supported by circa 300 colleagues. We've been doing that for more than 15 years. So we've built up a level of credibility, and within that, we've built up a level of established relationships, which I'll touch on in a minute in terms of supplier trust. But we've got 700 suppliers, and that includes the focus around DI as well. We've got 700 suppliers, over 1,000 factories from a global perspective, and that gives us a level of scale. It gives us a level of credibility. So I think that would be number one. The second one, in terms of, to use your word again, superpower, I'd say where we got is from an advantage perspective is around supplier trust. And again, I'll link this back to COVID. We've got a set of values that we like to think we operate against, but COVID was a really interesting. People handle, and you know that as well, Jen, as well as anybody. Retailers and all the brands handled COVID in different ways. We stood behind, as part of our values, we stood behind our commitments. The vast majority of products we completed manufacturing, we shipped. Where we did cancel some product, we made sure that there was a fair cost. We absolutely covered the cost of production, and where we did push out certain POs and certain orders a little bit further out and deferred them, we made sure that our suppliers didn't lose out commercially, and we maintained that level of dialogue. So I think supplier trust is really important, and I actually think it is. I think it's quite a big competitive advantage, increasingly more so now. Actually, I think it's always been there. Having a great relationship with your suppliers, having a relationship that's built on trust, that's a true relationship, that's more strategic and not transactional, has got to be the right thing. And you would argue it was there before COVID. But I think actually, given how COVID is handled in different ways, I think it's heightened it even more so actually, and hence why I think it is a competitive advantage. We've gone out deliberately and spent more time talking to suppliers. So we've increased the number of things like newsletters we do. We've increased the level of one-to-ones that we do in terms of, particularly with our more kind of key and strategic suppliers, about really spending more time with them. And through the technology we've now got, so things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom, we've embarked on more frequent. I wouldn't say they're the grandest conferences, but let's call them supplier engagement events. So we in fact we did one just a couple of weeks ago in terms of we had something like about 120, 130 clothing suppliers where we spent 2 hours with the team in the UK, taking them through our plans, sharing our thoughts, and also thanking them for their support. So I think the second one for me actually is definitely around supplier trust. So supplier scale, supplier trust. And then global approach. I described us to the team here and the team back in the UK as being very Asia-centric. Now, you could argue, well, that's always going to be us. We have our colleagues are in Asia, and that's where the majority of our supply base is. But actually, what we were was far too Asia-centric. And even though, don't get me wrong, Asia is really important. We'll actually grow Asia in many different countries. However, what we weren't particularly good at is we didn't have a very good all-round visibility, which I've touched on before, in terms of really understanding what's happening with own brand supply in Europe, what's happening in the Near East, etc., Turkey, and really making sure that we've got that one view. And then all the things that we've talked about so far, things like making the right decisions based on cost, speed, expertise, we can do that in a far more rounded way. So I think we're not Asia-centric. Our model is not focused just purely on, let's just use the example, cost as a percentage of sales or shipments. We like to think we are starting now to take a much more rounded view. So global approach. And then the other one, I think we've probably touched on as well, actually, in terms of superpower. I think the fact that we have as well as putting our arms around global, we're also putting our arms around the full own brand supply piece, agnostic of route. So we talked briefly around the role that third parties have to play, as well as obviously the investment we do around direct source, which enables us to make the right decisions based on value, commercials, etc. So scale, supplier trust, global in approach, and managing the entirety agnostic of route in terms of that direct source and third party piece together.
Well, that's quite a lot of powers. And I think that you can see they've served you well, particularly in a challenging year as this one has been. So when you're looking towards 2021, and I think all of us are sitting here and sort of, on the one hand, we want to get done with 2020, and on the other hand, we're wondering, well, what could be next? What do you see as the biggest challenges that you face?
It's a good question. So let me go first on social compliance. So I've already mentioned in terms of the values that Sainsbury's and Argos have in terms of it's important to us and how we operate. But social compliance clearly is an ethical standard is important to everybody. So I think the reason why I think it's going to be, we've got a strong ethical team based here across Asia, and they do some really good kind of work and support this area. However, I think ensuring that we've got visibility around social compliance, I think is going to be a challenge. I think our suppliers are still under pressure. I think we did, and I'm sure that most other brands did, a really great job during the early days of COVID, ensuring that they were staying close to all their factory base, making sure that they had the health and safety processes in place, PPE, etc., making sure that we're all in tune with how many colleagues, how many workers they had in their factories against the volume that was going through. I think that there's still a level of fragility there. And the bit I'd add on top, Jane, is that I think what we've got is we've got volume pressure as well. So we've got pressure starting to come through in terms of these, high demand areas, as well as we've got catch up being played, and as well as things like maybe people wanting to get ahead around certain moments in time in terms of things like Brexit, etc. So I think what all that means is our suppliers, as they're re-gearing their manufacturing up and have been over the last few months, I think they are under pressure. And I think what we need to do is make sure we stay really close to it, because, as a business, we take a, zero tolerance approach to things like subcontracting, because we have to, on direct source, we have to have that visibility of our supply base to be able to understand that we can sign it off ethically and technically. And we take a zero tolerance around things like forced labour. So particularly around the subcontracting piece is an area that translates to that fragility. Well, maybe when they're under pressure, and we know there are some factories out there, some factories in India, I spoke to one the other day, actually, their orders are 50% higher than where they thought they were going to be. I mean, that's going to put pressure on any factory. And therefore, we just need to make sure that social compliance is that we're as good as we need to be, and they're as good as they need to be, and we're connected as good as we need to be to ensure that all those ethical standards about people being paid on time, people being treated with the right conditions, the amount of overtime, etc., against the back of a much heightened customer interest around ethical. And again, you've seen some of the stories that have been out there in terms of things that have been uncovered. A lot of it uncovered on the back of the further interest, the human story interest around coronavirus. That'd be number one. The second one, I think the changing customer demands. I think there's still going to be movement here. I mean, I think the biggest question that a number of us have all got is around some of the high demand areas. So let me just give you some examples in Sainsbury's. So we had a huge demand through coronavirus on things like chest freezers, in terms of people wanting to store more food at home, so through the Argos channel, office furniture, loungewear versus formal wear. And I think one of the questions that we're all facing is that now a new permanent trend, or does it drop back? So have we peaked on our customers in the UK buying office furniture? Or is that trend only now going to continue because people are still adjusting in terms of their lifestyles? So I think that our ability to understand changing customer demands, so that we do that obviously through staying really close to, in our case, we'd be really close to the UK, what's happening with the customer, what our buyers are seeing, what's the sense of where the market is going. But also, I think what we need to do is stay really close to our suppliers. much higher up on the agenda for us in terms of talking to our suppliers and really explaining to them in terms of the different product high demand areas and where the trends are going, and then it's about how can we react to them. So when they do exist and when they do pop up, and there'll be more that will pop up, how do we exploit those opportunities? How do we do the speed to market piece that we talked about earlier? And how do we also minimize any threats? So I think social compliance, changing customer demands, I think financial pressure, I think is one that we have to watch and track. So we've got a small finance team out here in Asia. We spend a lot of time really understanding in terms of, let's call it the financial health of our own brand suppliers. And sometimes it's not even driven by, it's not even about the impact just purely, not even driven by their own financial standing, but equally what's also there out in the world is there's still a huge amount of fragility around retailers. And you're a supplier and you get 2 or 3 retailers that suddenly go into receivership and they're in a difficult place, etc. Then a supplier that was robust for a period of time is now not robust, and again staying close to our suppliers around financial pressure. And I suppose what it does do is it drive even further that actually this taking cost out for both them and us is good in terms against that financial pressure. And then just a couple of those very briefly. Traceability, I've mentioned already around tier 1 through to tier 3. Our customers are demanding more. We've kicked off a mapping exercise. We publish in terms of tier 1 clothing sites, for instance, already. We've kicked off what is a quite complex piece of work, actually, in terms of really working with our suppliers. And we can only do it, Jane, with our suppliers, but working through in terms of those different tiers, because ultimately our customers are going to want to know, where our products come from. Really, really important to us. And then one that actually is, I really would like to think this is not going to last for the whole of 2021, but I certainly think it's going to be around at the start of 2021, and that's around supply chain pressure. I think where we are at this moment in time in terms of supply chain, so what I mean by supply chain, so the whole logistics piece of containers and shipping, I think is probably one of the most challenged places it's been. Normally, it kind of runs as clockwork, and I think with the pressures around COVID and containers still in many places, the wrong parts of the world, and then you couple that with increased demand and freight forwarders and shipping companies that are not fully back up to full capacity. I think our personal view is that that's the challenge that we've got is going to be still with us for certainly the other side of Chinese New Year through to February, so early part of 2021. I do think it's quite unprecedented, actually. And again, what that's driving out is for us need to communicate and stay close to our manufacturing base and close to our logistics partners like we've never been before, in terms of to make sure that we are prioritizing and also giving as much forward visibility as possible. So I think, we've faced into a lot, we've learned a lot, there's a lot to be proud of, and as I said earlier, it's been, kind of instrumental, COVID, in terms of pushing our overarching strategy forward in many, many areas. But I do still think there are a lot of challenges still out there, the examples, I've given around things like social compliance, reacting to customer demands, reacting to financial pressure points in the supply chain, need for traceability, supporting supply chain pressure as an overarching piece are still all there to play out.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that most people are facing similar problems, and certainly no one was expecting logistics to become a problem, but as you said, things that you didn't expect to become problems that always ran like clockwork can all of a sudden become the big problem spot. What you're doing makes sense because it's planning in advance as opposed to trying to put out fires constantly.
I think you're right, Jane. I think the word planning is so important, and I think every one of us would say that we've experienced a lot, we've learned a lot, and I think it's how we take all that experience and learnings into then what do we then have to do in terms of future planning against the backdrop of what still is quite an uncertain world.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, talking of planning, how much of your focus is surviving through this pandemic, however long that may last, and how much is future focused, which is a big picture, that's not specifically pandemic focused?
Yeah, great question. I'd say probably 10% survive and 90% on planning in terms of future view. So, and the reason why I say that actually is that we've been quite fortunate as a business in terms of the fact that we're a sizable number two supermarket retailer after Tesco in the UK, top 10 retailer in terms of apparel through to, and one of the most visited websites in terms of online for the Argos channel in terms of supporting general merchandise. And I think a combination of all those has helped probably make us a little bit more insular in terms of the pressure points that the survived moments that maybe some of the competition had to face into. That said, I think our big moment of survive was that you go back when COVID hit down in the UK, which is still a figure that I kind of think, wow, we did that. And I'm very proud of what we did as a team. And we pretty much put $350 million worth of POs on hold at a moment in time. Not that we were necessarily going to cancel them. As I said earlier, we cancelled very little, but more because actually we need to understand exactly where we were and what was required. And we did that. And in a 3-week period, we pretty much worked our way through across those, 1,000 factories, 700 suppliers, and got to all the right answers, or the majority of the right answers. We never get everything 100% right. And I think that that was our moment in terms of survive. Getting to those right decisions that's right for customer, commercials, and suppliers. And as we said before, we learned a lot. So that was our survive bit. And I think the emphasis now really is around how do we kind of push on in terms of future view. And a lot of it we've covered already, Jane. But I mean, just to either reinforce or share some other points, I think this piece around truly global, I think is really, really important in terms of enable us to get kind of a full view of the global outlook and operations. I think being adaptable to change, we've touched on that. We want to be a sourcing function that listens, constantly evolves, is quick in terms of responding to the external environment, and also delivering that change in partnership with our supply base. We would have in terms of future view about right size. So I would say that we are still a growing. We source over $1 billion US, but we're still a growing business. It's really exciting. We're going to grow DS further. We're going to enhance the stuff we do with third parties. But we're still a growing business. But actually maintaining a level of efficiency and right size is going to be important. We want to be lean, not fat, and we've still got opportunities here in terms of to ensure that we are doing things in the most efficient way. So right size is key. Future view, what else would there be? I think capability is increasingly becoming important, whether that be around, we're a diverse and inclusive retailers, or, embrace all the new ideas, but even just the basic elements of making sure that people have got capability, because actually, particularly with our teams in Asia, because if we're in a world, and a part of our strategy is around how do we drive efficiency, which what that means is we're actually going to, in essence, do more of those critical path elements, do more of those process elements, do more of those empowerment pieces with our suppliers out here in Asia, as opposed to the UK. What we need to have is the credibility. We need to have the skill set and the ability to do that. Things like visibility and transparency are absolutely key. And then I'd probably sum up by saying, and that's around the importance of true partnership versus the transactional relationship. And I think, really having that level of involvement with our suppliers, partnerships that are built on trust, strong communication, they are proven in terms of delivering results, but also the results and the upside, whether that be, reduction in costs, improved profitability, that's one that's shared as well. So I think partnership versus transactional will probably be the final one I would say in terms of our overarching view around the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you look at companies that have been successful before the pandemic and companies that are looking like they're coming through it a lot better than others, they all tend to have a long-term plan, and they're working that plan. But there's enough flexibility built in that when something comes out of the blue, like a pandemic, they can react quickly. However, overall, they're sticking to that plan, as opposed to other companies which tend to always be in reactive mode, putting out fires, barely surviving from one quarter to the next.
I think you've summed that up brilliantly well, Jane. I'd fully support that in terms of particularly around that element of the delivering against plans, delivering against strategies, not being derailed. We talked a little bit around that in terms of Brexit. Some of the situations through COVID. Having a good plan and thinking maybe slightly more long term than short term. And I think maybe some pressure points that are out there. I think it's either forcing people, maybe brands, maybe retailers, maybe suppliers, actually forcing people to make decisions on maybe a short term view versus actually what is the longer term, the right thing to do in terms of longer term. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of I think what COVID has taught us absolutely is that you have to be able to have that level of flexibility and adaptability.
It's been great speaking with you, Dean, and really enjoyed hearing about how you're managing Sainsbury's very complex global supply chain, particularly in the face of two big monsters, COVID and Brexit, and also how you're positioning that supply chain to thrive in 2021, which looks like it could be just as challenging as this year.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Jane.
If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to the podcast? You'll be notified each week as we release a new episode. And if you're looking for a sharp view of global sourcing, or you're struggling to get your quarterly sourcing reports done, you might want to take a look at the current situation in sourcing. These executive snapshot reports include all the insights and data you need without you having to do the work. In other words, all that tedious work is now done for you. You can find a link for further information in the show notes here.